Good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people in Canberra, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And for many of you who are listening to me this afternoon on the lands of the Ghana people, I also pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I think that it is very appropriate that we in Australia commemorate Hiroshima Day, that we commemorate the day on which a nuclear weapon was delivered in Japan and bombed the city of Hiroshima, and that so many people in Hiroshima died on that day. That was a human tragedy for the people of Japan, but it was also a human tragedy for everybody in the world, in that it was one of two major nuclear explosions that led to the ending of the Second World War. I think it's very important that we in Australia remember Hiroshima Day because we have a long history of suffering the effects of war. It is little known that Australia had amongst the highest per capita death rate in the First World War and a very high per capita death rate in the Second World War, though in that war we were actually beaten by New Zealand because New Zealand had a higher death rate per capita than Australia did. So we are two nations who know what it means to suffer the loss of our people in war and to spend so many years mourning and grieving for all of those people whose lives were cut short in the defence of our nation. So, as I say, it is appropriate that we in Australia should remember Hiroshima Day. One of the things I think that is really important about this is that we are peoples whose democracy goes to the heart of what it means to defend our nation. And democracy is ultimately what it should be all about for us. And that brings me very quickly to the matter that I've been particularly asked to address this afternoon, which is the decision taken by the previous government under Mr. Morrison to acquire the nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS agreement, and the decision taken by the current government to proceed with that agreement. The AUKUS decision was itself a massive failure in public accountability. It is important that we, in participating in the election of our governments, expect those governments to be fully accountable back to us, the voter. And that certainly did not happen with the AUKUS decision. We were presented with a decision over which the Australian people had no prior knowledge and certainly no power to be able to contest the decision or even to offer an effective veto to it, since the opposition was itself dragged into support for the decision because the opposition did not want to contest it. It's important too to understand that the AUKUS decision is premised on a set of totally unacceptable risk levels. And this afternoon I'd like to raise with you very briefly 7 levels of risk which I think go to the heart of the problems with the AUKUS decision. The first is strategic risk. Why is it that a country such as Australia, with a population of 25 million people, should want to acquire big nuclear-powered submarines to act such a long distance from Australia, ostensibly in our defence, but more to take warfare to the front door of a country which is itself a nuclear weapon state? Beyond strategic risk, there's the critically important question of sovereign risk. As we look at the complexity of the AUKUS submarine proposal, we discover very quickly that in virtually no category of construction, of design or of operation does Australia exercise sovereignty over the capability which it's intending to acquire. We don't know how to design them, we don't know how to build them. At this point, we don't know how to operate them. We certainly don't know how to manage the propulsion system. And in all of this, we are going to be absolutely dependent on allies to mount and to sustain this capability. More than that, there's industrial risk. At this point, we have no capacity to build these submarines. We have no capacity to sustain them. We can invest in the capacity to build and sustain these submarines, but the risk in doing that is that we forego many other choices that we might make in the expansion of Australia's manufacturing industry. That's a very high level of risk to sustain for a capability which adds so relatively little to our overall ability to defend the nation against attack. Beyond industrial risk, there's operational risk, and this is a risk that I think is particularly serious. We are going to be operating a very, very large submarine, effectively in shallow waters, if they're to be operated off the coast of China, against an adversary which is well capable of detecting such large vessels. So that we put not only our vessels and their crews at risk, but we put a large part of our naval capability at risk at the moment we seek to operate them. Now, this is a big ask, I think, of a country which is imagining that it will have a maximum number of 8 of these submarines, which means that at any one time we can operate either 2 or 3 of them. So the operational risk is extremely high. Beyond all of this, there's a nuclear materials risk, and this also, I think, is fraught. We have no capacity at the moment in Australia to manage nuclear waste, and just this week in which I'm making this statement to you, the Federal Court of Australia dismissed the claims of the Commonwealth, and particularly of the South Australian government, that nuclear waste could be stored on the Eyre Peninsula, and agreed with the Bangarra people that they would be able to sustain their own lands, to exercise their sovereignty without being required to store nuclear waste. And if the Bangarra people can't sustain nuclear waste, why should any other people in Australia have their lands allocated to the storage of nuclear waste? The waste question is a big one, and it's one that would need to be addressed before we acquire such nuclear propulsion in our submarines. Beyond that, we have reputational risk. And this, I think, is something that we've got to think through very, very carefully. We know already that the governments of Indonesia and Malaysia take a dim view to Australia's acquisition of nuclear-propelled submarines, as do most of the governments of the South Pacific. Why do we want to put our reputation at risk for so little real strategic benefit? It defies logic, and it certainly defies good common sense in the conduct of our foreign policy. There is, more than that, massive financial risk. Now, this has been drawn to our attention by very many people, and I'm proposing only just to touch on it. We know already that the government's early calculations of cost are in the order of $368 billion. But we also know already that the Parliamentary Budget Office has extended that cost to well over $500 billion, and for any of us who've been familiar with the way in which defence budgets are spent over long project periods, we can expect this particular project cost to be at least 3 times bigger than the government's estimated cost. In essence, we're talking about a total project cost well in excess of $1 trillion. Now, we can afford $1 trillion. That's not the point. The point is that we can afford $1 trillion only when we forsake many other opportunities. What do we give up to afford these nuclear-powered submarines? Do we give up early child education and child care? Do we give up aged care? Do we have a lower standard of public health care? Do we run an education system which is not as capable as we would want it to be if we are to develop our economy and our way of living through the rest of this century? In other words, the opportunity costs have got to be brought into consideration. And at this point, we just don't know whether the billions and billions of dollars that this project is going to cost are going to be worth the opportunity cost that they will entail. Now, in all of this, our voters have a duty and a responsibility to bring their concerns to the attention of the government and of ministers, so that as we consider today what it meant for the people of Japan and for the people of the world to be the target of the use of nuclear weapons, to see weapons of mass destruction delivered against the civilian population of Japan, we also have to consider what we're doing in the deployment of weapons systems that go to the heart of fighting wars between nuclear powers. I think it's important too that we should remember that a decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines in a fundamental sense flies in the face of the responsibility that we have as a nation that has experienced the pains of war to do whatever we can to avoid going to war again, but particularly to avoid the risk of war with countries and between countries that are nuclear armed. So for all of us, we have a responsibility on Hiroshima Day to consider deeply what the AUKUS decision means, and I think to resist it. Thank you for taking the trouble of listening to me this afternoon.